Hello and welcome. This is Clint Berry with Superior Livestock Auction, and I'm joined today with Davey Jones from Ag Defense Risk Management. Davey, you want to tell us a little bit about what your company does for producers out in the field?
I'll be glad to. Ag Defense is a risk management or insurance agency. We're based out of Elgin, Oklahoma. We encompass about 22 states in the area that we make our products and our services available to. We have a full line of insurance services, but we're primarily focused in the arena of crop insurance. So we try to help our producers manage those risks that the federal crop insurance policies help them address, and do that in the most efficient way. We've historically been very heavy in the lines of federal crop insurance that apply to cattle producers, and so the rainfall and the livestock products are our main emphasis.
Absolutely. And so a lot of producers are going to be familiar with the terms like LRP or livestock protection. But one of the services that your company's offering is livestock gross margin, or what we call LGM. Can you tell us a little bit about that product and maybe a little bit about the history of that and where that comes from? Because that's one product that most producers have not heard of in prior years.
Sure. I'd be glad to do that. Matter of fact, it is the relationship with the livestock risk protection that kind of led us to investigate the livestock gross margin. If you're familiar with the livestock risk protection, after changes were made to it in 2020, it became kind of the front runner in terms of risk management for price, both in feeder cattle and in fed cattle. It has grown in its popularity tremendously. But as you look at how well it competes with alternate ways of managing risk, it's much more competitive for the feeder cattle, the lighter calves. Not so much that it's not applicable to fed cattle, but the price advantageous aspect of it is not nearly as attractive on fed cattle. And so we basically kind of investigated the reason why that was true. And after calling quite a few people through the crop insurance world and at the USDA and at some of the universities where these products were developed, really never got a firm answer. And our end thought on that was that when livestock risk protection was introduced in 2007, livestock gross margin was introduced right alongside it. And the only thing that really seems to make sense when you look at the price discrepancies between feeder and fed cattle on LRP is that the framers of those programs were convinced that the livestock gross margin would be a better risk management tool for managing fed cattle risk than LRP fed cattle would be, and that they priced the LRP in such a way to cause people to more closely examine and consider livestock gross margin. There was no subsidies to livestock gross margin initially, and so even though that seems to be the attempt, it really didn't pan out that way. Livestock gross margin has virtually zero following in the country, compared to LRP, which has grown in popularity from around 500,000 head prior to the changes in 2020 to currently around 6 million head insured following those changes. The livestock gross margin had similar improvements made in 2020, but the lack of an audience produced a lack of response to those changes. And so our goal through what we're doing here today is try to bring not just the changes to light, that has been fairly well communicated, but how those changes can be applied to better manage risk to fed cattle, whether you're a feed yard owner or partner, or whether you're an individual producer feeding your own cattle.
So Davey, as we start talking about livestock gross margin, as with anything, there's terminology discussions that for a better understanding of what goes on. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Let's put some of that in perspective so that we can delve into what this product can offer for producers.
Sure. Yeah, I think we can do that. And the way we'll try to address this is we'll talk kind of about the mechanics of the program in this first session. And then we'll talk about two specific applications in the two sessions that follow. So we'll kind of go through the nuts and bolts, and yes, I think some terms that are going to be being used would be good to kind of point out as we get started. So the livestock gross margin if you were going to define it, it would be to where a product that ensures the future actual results of feeding cattle compared to what the expected results were in the beginning. And so we'll flesh that out a little as we go through it, but that's what the livestock gross margin program is designed to do. Within that framework, there's terms like target marketing month, which would refer to the month that the fed cattle are expected to leave the feed yard.
Correct.
And so as we go through this, that terminology will come up time and time again. The expected gross margin would be, for example, if you were buying livestock gross margin insurance today, it's going to calculate what you expect the gross margin, the difference in feeder cattle and corn compared to fed cattle at some point in the future is going to be.
Okay.
And so the expected gross margin is where it all begins. When the coverage ends, when those cattle leave the feed yard, then an actual gross margin is calculated. So an actual gross margin would be the final calculated value of one fed animal less the inputs,
Right.
feeder, calf, and corn.
Okay.
And then the gross margin guarantee would be the difference in the two, the difference in the expected and the actual. So we'll talk about gross margin guarantee a few times as we make our way through this. And a gross margin loss would be that event that would occur if the actual gross margin, what actually happens in the feed yard, ends up being less than what the expected gross margin was. So then you would have what's termed a gross margin loss. The sales period is a weekly option that you have to buy coverage. So every Thursday, when markets close around 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the USDA puts out the coverage premium and the gross margin expected values. And you have until 9 a.m. the following morning, 9 a.m. Friday morning, to exercise the option to buy. So the sales period would be that period from Thursday afternoon to Friday morning.
Okay.
And that happens once a week. The covered period is the 11 months that follow the sales period. So you can cover cattle up to 11 months out.
Okay.
With one stipulation. You can't cover any cattle in the first month of that 11-month period. So you can ensure 10 months of production should you choose to. So that's the covered period. Pooled coverage it would be a scenario where you would insure more than 1 month's target marketings at a time. So if you wanted to do all 10 months in one sales period, then you would have 10-month pooled coverage. You can go down as low as 1 or as many as 10 months in a pool. So that becomes real critical especially when we get to the flexible features of LGM. Okay. And then finally, there's a deductible option. You can choose to have zero deductible. You can choose to have up to $150 per head deductible. And honestly, when I read about the deductibles as I first began to investigate this, I thought it would probably be one of the least attractive features. But when we get through with these 3 sessions, I think you'll probably agree it's one of the more interesting options and one of the more interesting points of flexibility in the whole program. So those terms will be helpful as we kind of move on through this process. I think that it's good to kind of divide the program up and asking kind of why it works and how it works. And so first I'd like to maybe just throw some things out about why it works. Some of these make it unique to LGM. Some of these are not unique to LGM, but they may be unique to crop insurance in general. So the why it works question kind of start off by pointing out that what LGM does is it provides an adjustable mirror to how people typically use futures contracts when protecting fed cattle risk. So it's not actually buying futures contracts, but it's using numbers in a calculated formula that are based on futures contracts. And so, what it does is it does the same thing that people do when they buy options or when they buy futures contracts. It just does it with mathematical calculations instead of actual contracts. So I think that becomes paramount in some areas when we look at how we would want to apply this. It also offers an extreme amount of flexibility in other ways. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some very concrete things that, depending on how you use the concrete features, you create flexibility. So it is relatively important when you look into this to talk with someone who understands not just that it's there, that it's available, that LGM is a federal crop insurance program, but understands the nuts and bolts about what makes it work and how you can tailor it to meet your specific needs, regardless of where you're involved at in the fed cattle process. But probably the most significant thing, and this is part of some of the changes that happened with LGM in 2020, at the same time that LRP had changes that caused it to, soar in popularity. Prior to these changes, LGM had a very low head limit annually. So if you were feeding very many cattle, you really ran out of the protection pretty early on. There's currently no head limit. So the 2020 changes eliminated the head limit. It also changed the premium structure from being paid on the front end to the back end of coverage. So you don't have your operating capital tied up while you're feeding the cattle. And then it also went from a zero subsidy to an 18 to 50% subsidy based on the deductible that you choose. So I think you can see some of the flexibility features beginning to kind of come out. Something that I think people who are heavily involved in crop insurance realize, but what I find is a lot of cattlemen have never really participated in any form of crop insurance, and so they don't really understand the relationship between subsidies and return on investment. And so what is the main thing that makes livestock gross margin work and work well is the same thing that makes all federal crop insurance work well. It's the amount of subsidy. And so we built a chart that shows the relationship of percent subsidy to return on investment. And so just as kind of an introduction to the concept and to kind of keep us thinking openly about this deductible, what we found is that at a $0 per head deductible, under a particular scenario, and we applied this to several different scenarios, but in some of the least advantageous scenarios, at a zero deductible, we had about a 5 to 7% return on investment, which in today's environment is not terrible. But at a $70 deductible, we saw about a 17.5% return on investment. And this is in the least desirable end result in terms of how you structure coverage. So that's kind of a starting place. And when you look long term at return on money invested, 17.5% sure fares pretty well compared to 5%.
That's right. That's a big difference. And nice to know that there is some flexibility built within that program for producers to tailor it to their needs. They just need to be confident in that they're working with their trusted provider to understand how all that applies and what best fits their scenarios.
Correct. It's no different than anything else. It's kind of like a fingerprint. How LGM will work best in your feeding operation is going to look different than a neighbor. And so not only is it important to consult with someone who kind of has a pretty good handle on this program, it needs to be a one-on-one. I mean, obviously we would like to take this time and make a video and just answer everyone's questions about their own operation. That's it's unrealistic. Right. So I think the goal of these videos is going to be to give you enough information as a producer to say this is something I should look more closely at or not. And so if we can accomplish that before we get done with these 3 sessions, then we think that we'll have done what we set out to do, which was to kind of bring this product out of the shadows, kind of into the light, so people could see whether it's something that they need to look more closely at. So as we look at those concrete features of livestock gross margin, there's basically 4 pillars that it's built upon. And through our conversation about the kind of the terms that are used, we've covered a little bit of this, but I think it's good to kind of reinforce that these things in and of themselves cannot be changed.
Right.
But they can be used in an interrelated way to create a lot of flexibility. So let's talk about the concrete features. Livestock margin has these four things that we need to really keep in mind and understand in a pretty thorough way to do a good job of structuring the coverage that a producer would want to have. First of all would be those expected versus the actual gross margin. That's not something that we can redo. If I was going to redo some of those, I probably would, but I don't have that option. So those are fixed. There's a calculated formulas that are used to establish the expected and the actual gross margins, and we'll look at those in just a second.
And the only changes for a producer to choose in that scenario would be what week they purchase the coverage in.
Right. Yeah, your coverage option is up to you, but how the calculations are carried out, that's not up to us. We don't get to change those. Then there's two types of coverage. One for calf fed, so those would be calves brought to the feed yard, 550 to 600 pounds. Then there's yearling fed, which would be 750 pounds or greater. So there's two types, and the values that are used in those calculations are different because you got two different types of livestock.
So a producer gets to that point in the decision-making process, and they need to understand how that best applies to their operation, whether they're planning on feeding calf feds, or I should just say protecting, how's that? Because they may not even be purchasing that as a feeder, but calf feds or yearlings, and that is predominantly depicted in upon what that weight scenario is, because some producers have calves bigger than others, some have lighter, but the important thing there is to understand that those programs can be tailored to how it best fits your scenario, although there is a structure to what those formulas are.
Right. Yeah. Bottom line is the coverage would apply at the weight that they were at when they arrived in the feed yard. Mm-hmm. When they got to that final destination, were they closer to the 6 weights or were they closer to the 750 to 8?
Correct.
There is a little bit of variance in that, but it's probably best to just kind of look at that fairly concretely and say, when I choose my type, it's going to be based on how heavy they are when they hit
the yard. Yeah. So the producer makes that decision as to going left or right according to what his calf weights may be as to what coverage best fits him.
Correct. Right, and then the third is one we've talked about a little bit, is the pooled and non-pooled coverage. This creates a tremendous amount of flexibility. It also creates a tremendous amount of variability in pricing. So the flexibility that it creates needs to be weighed against the variability of cost. And so we've got some tools to kind of help us sort through that and find out what the best fit is for producers in that area. But that you have to either be pooled or non-pooled isn't an option. The way you set your coverage up will be pooled or it will be non-pooled.
Once again, another decision for the producer to make is what best fits their program and maybe what best fits their risk appetite a little, depending on how they're foreseeing that.
Right. And some of the other data that we kind of look over may help in that decision. Okay. For example, you may want to run pooled or non-pooled, but then you may want to use some seasonal trends in how you set the coverage up. So there's lots of things to consider. It's kind of like a combine. You look at a combine the first time, you think, I'll never understand how this thing works because there's so many moving parts. But basically, a combine is not that complicated if you break it down. LGM is not that complicated, but there are a lot of moving parts. And our goal is to try to help identify those moving parts, explain how they work, the pros and cons, and then you can make your decisions as we go through.
To take the time to work with a producer to make sure that they can make that program match to their goals, their needs.
Exactly. And then the final of the 4 pillars, the unchangeable things, is that you will have to choose a deductible, and that deductible will have an attached subsidy level. You can choose to have 0 deductible, which will have attached to it an 18% subsidy. You can go as high as $150 per head deductible, which I'm not going to say there's not places where that would apply, but generally what we find is that the advantage of taking on more risk yourself goes away when you stop getting additional subsidies in exchange for that added risk. So since the subsidy reaches a 50% level at a $70 per head deductible, it's just going to be very rare that someone would look at more than a $70 deductible, and we'll also you can look back at that chart. We'll look at it again a little later and kind of drive that point home.
That's interesting to break it down like that as a return on investment, and once again, to reinforce the fact that producers, depending upon their risk appetite, can select what coverage is best for them.
Right, right. And as we get into the specific applications, I think that the importance of that becomes a little more magnified. And so that's a good point, and one that we'll follow up on kind of in the second and third sessions. So now to take those 4 pillars and put a little bit of flesh to those, the expected gross margin and the actual gross margin are calculated numbers, as we've mentioned. Well, the obvious question to producers at that point would be, well, how are they calculated? And so we'll go into that real briefly, and we're going to start with the yearling fed type. And as we mentioned, the values are different on the calf fed versus yearling.
Right.
But we'll start.
One of those choices that the producer has to make as to how that coverage is going to best suit their program.
Right. So on a given day, when those sales periods open, if you choose to buy coverage, the calculation for a yearling is going to be made as follows. It's going to basically use calculations to determine the feeder calf cost that will be used in the calculation, the corn cost that will be used in the calculation, and the fed steer cost that will be used in the calculation on that day looking forward. Okay, and the way that happens is it stems from the target marketing date, the day the calf will come out of the feed yard. Okay, so the feeder calf portion of that equation is determined 5 months prior to the end of the month when the cattle will come out of the feed yard. So it's 5 months back, and it's a 750-pound weight. So, and it's the previous 3 trading days. So if we were looking forward to, say, December today, 5 months back would be July, and that July number would be the 3 previous days' trade. So on a Thursday, it would be Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of July feeder cattle market averaged times a 750-pound steer to get the feeder calf portion of the equation.
Yep.
Corn is going to be 2 months back of the target marketing date, so we'd be backing up to October, taking the previous 3 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, of the October futures market for corn, average those 3 days, multiply that times 50 bushels of corn. That would give us our corn portion of the expected gross margin calculation. The third portion of that is the fed cattle portion. That portion would look at the December fed cattle market, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, get an average there, take that times 1,250 pounds, and that becomes your fed cattle portion. And the fed cattle portion less the corn and feeder becomes the expected gross margin that's used in the contract. Now, obviously, anyone who deals with feeders or futures markets very much knows that all of those months don't even have futures contracts. Right. So the LGM has a resolution to that, and the way it does it is it uses the simple average of the month before and after in months where there isn't a contract, or if there's a 3-month gap, it'll use a weighted average. But you can market cattle and insure cattle on LGM in whichever month you choose, which in some ways becomes an advantage, and other people would say, sometimes that would be a disadvantage. So, but it is a part of the features of the program.
But that's a good point to know, because of missing contracts on times, that there's always an option there to make coverage whenever the coverage best fits your program as to when your cattle are ready to go.
Correct.
Right.
So that's the expected gross margin side, and then the same calculations are used on the actual gross margin side. The only difference is that instead of using the previous 3 trading days as with expected gross margin, on the actual gross margin it uses the last 3 trading days of the specific months. So on the actual gross margin side, the feeder cattle portion would be the closing price on the last 3 trading days of the month, T minus 5. Okay. On the corn, it would be the last 3 trading days for October corn, which would be T minus 2, the December 2 months back. Okay. And then on the fed cattle, it would be the last 3 trading days of December. All of those averaged and then multiplied by the respective weights. 750 pounds on a feeder, 50 bushels on the corn, and 1,250 pounds on the fed.
And that formula is the use of those averages. That formula is the same for everybody. The only time it's different is whether or not you're doing a calf fed or a yearling type animal to make that change.
Correct. Yep. And what you're ensuring is the difference between the expected and the actual. So naturally, when the actual gross margins end up being better than the expected, there's no claim, no loss. You've got a premium, but you don't have a loss because it ended up better. So that's kind of the mechanics of the calculations. And then, like you mentioned, the calf fed is the exact same process, except the values that we use or the volumes we use on the weights are different. On a calf fed, you're ending up with an 1,150 pound steer instead of a 1,250 pound steer. And on the feeder portion, you're T-8 instead of T-5, so you're 8 months back on the feeder cattle portion, and you're 4 months back on the corn portion, and the corn portion is 52 bushels. So that and the weight on the feeder calf is 550 pounds versus 750 on the yearling. So the math is the same, but the months that are used and the weights that are used are different. But the rest of it follows the exact same pattern.
And I think it's important to know, because I know the first time that I looked at those formulas, my mind starts racing and I think about, well, I've got cattle that come in at a weight bigger than 7.5 or bigger than 5.5, or it takes me more time or less time, or more or less the bushels of corn, and all those scenarios play out. But the concept that's important to understand is there's an estimated starting point and an actual finish point. And regardless of what those numbers are, you can still use those start and end dates to match up your cattle, even if you're killing 1,500 pound animals instead of 12.5, or even if you're feeding 9 weights instead of 750 weights. And all you're really doing there is trying to protect what the estimated cost going in versus the actual, so that program can cover that variance in pricing that we all know lives in the fed cattle market.
Right. Yeah, and one of the most common concerns with these calculations is that most cattle going into the feed yards these days are more than 750 pounds, and they're taking them to more than 1,250 pounds finished weight, which obviously takes more corn. Right. And so there is a way to, the formulas are fixed, but you can vary that up to about 20%. Based on the head count that you insure. That's something that we would just talk about as we get to that portion in kind of detailing how we would apply it in an individual scenario. But there is a way to adjust that to a certain degree. So that's one of the earlier flexibilities that we'll talk about, but there is a way to modify that somewhat. Okay. So that's kind of the difference in the values is really the only difference in the calculations. And then if we wanted to put this in kind of a longhand form, I'm not going to say I looked at this and got it just exactly, but I thought, it would be beneficial to kind of have a scenario, kind of an example. Right. So if you went back about a year ago and you said, okay, I'm gonna purchase some insurance, I'm going to purchase an LGM policy, and I dated this back, I think it was May 28th of 21, for cattle that are coming out in December, kind of to stick with our example. Yep. And I made the decision to purchase the livestock gross margin on that May 28th date. When I look at my expected gross margin on yearling fed cattle, and I went through the math and kind of got the estimates for the fed cattle, the average of December fed cattle on May the 24th, 25th, and 26th was 132.40 per hundredweight times a 1,250 pound steer, gave me a 1665 value coming out of the feed yard. Mm-hmm. So now I've got that value, and you look down and you say the feeder then would be the average of July futures on feeder cattle on May 24th, 25th, 26th, or the equivalent of July if you had to use the weighted or the simple average. It was 136.40 on a 750 weight, which was $1,023. The corn on the corn average of October on May 24th, 25th, and 26th of 21 was 543 a bushel times 50 bushels of corn, which gave us a $271.50 per head corn input cost. So the expected gross margin would have been the $16.55 less the corn plus the feeders, which would have had an expected gross margin of $360.50 per head. So that purchase of that insurance would have been insuring an expected gross margin of $360.50 per head. So then we go forward and we look at what those numbers all panned out to be on the actuals. Mm-hmm. So the calculated end of December values, and I would put on here, it's regardless of when you sell them. So if those cattle were a little slow getting ready and they didn't sell till January, that's fine.
Good point.
That's fine, but the insurance is going to settle as if you had sold them in the month you insured them. So that's another one of those concrete things. The target marketing month cannot change once you take out the
insurance. Once you take the policy,
yep.
Even though the cattle may die at a different time frame.
Yep.
That's understandable.
Exactly. So what actually happened was, the actual gross margin of fed cattle on the end date was $139.11 per hundred times the 1,250 weight. So we had an ending value of $1738.87. Our feeder calf, the average of the last 3 trading days of July feeders, or the equivalent, was 162.66 times a 7.5 weight. So you had a $1,218.75 per head input cost. The corn was $5.20 a bushel, so you had $260. So the actual gross margin was the $1738.87 minus the combination of the feeder and the corn, which gave us an actual ending gross margin of $260.12. So you had right at $100 a head loss in that example. Had those numbers been reversed, you'd have had $100 a head gain and no loss. Right. So it's ensuring, again, the difference in the expected and the actual margins. You could have that scenario in a variety of coverage methods. Mm-hmm. So what the cost of the premium would have been would depend on how you set up coverage. This could be as cheap as $4 or $5 per head, or it can be as high as $50 to $60 a head. And all of the cost to benefit depends on how you want to use it and how you see it applying in your situation. So this can be very affordable under certain coverage levels and arrangements, but it can also be very costly but still very effective because you're asking more from it in those scenarios. So there's a wide range of cost, and there's a wide range of when it will benefit you, and those need to be tailored to fit in place of or in addition to what you're already doing in your risk management strategy. And again, that'll be kind of the topic of the 2 sessions that follow.
More of that flexibility for the producer to decide how that program best fits him. And as you alluded to there, with or without additional hedging that they may be doing, traditional type, using futures contracts and things, this can be a supplement to it, a piece in its own, or an addition to.
Right. I think as the product was developed, the intention was that it would be a replacement of. Mm-hmm. The more we look at it, the more scenarios we run, the more data we look at, there obviously will be places that's true. But I think the greater use is going to be in a supplement to existing risk management strategies. I think that's where it's going to find its home in most places.
And so as you've talked about some of those calculations and how we get to those premium coverages and what that means on the estimated and the actuals, let's delve a little deeper into the choices that the producer makes. Earlier you brought up pooled and non-pooled, and I thought that was an interesting scenario to play out, is how that could best fit for each individual producer. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. On the non-pooled or the pooled option, what you're doing is you're having gross margin variances that are determined by month. And those expected target months are going to always come up with their own loss for the cattle that are covered in that month. The decision is, do we want to combine the net result of one month with another month or with 9 more months? It's like, how pooled do we want this coverage to actually play out, and what does that look like, and how does that change things?
This very much could could lay into a producer's own risk appetite.
Sure.
Is what, that's really what you sense from that is, if you want to put all your eggs in one basket and take the risk and reward of that, or spread them out over multiple months to maybe not pay off as well and maybe pay off even better, but it allows that, once again, that producer to make that decision on his own.
Sure, and of course premium risk is one of the considerations, and so you can alter premium by pooling. And so what happens when you pool coverage is the claims are based on each month, but the losses in one month could be offset by gains in another month. And so there's pros and cons to pooling coverage. The pro is that as you pool coverage, you get lower premiums. The con is that the losses in each individual month will offset one another. So if you have one month that gains $50,000 in estimated gross margin versus actual, so you've made more money there, so you don't have a loss there, but the next month you lose $50,000, you have an actual gross margin that's $50,000 less, you still don't have a claim because they offset one another. That's why the premium's cheaper.
Right.
There's places where that's a good decision and fits what a producer wants to happen, and there's other places where it don't. So the pooled and non-pooled is a big decision. Just how pooled? Do you want to pool 1 month or 2 months or 3 months together or 10 months? So that becomes part of the conversation. And the way you use that pooling might change from one market condition to the next. And so it's a very reactive program that can look different on 1 month's decision making versus another. And so it's a real interesting aspect of it. The other thing to remember is that the loss that is paid when you pool will always be at the end of the covered period. So if you're pooling 10 months together, you're going to have one potential date where you would have a loss paid. If you're pooling 2 months together, then you would have a potential loss settlement every 2 months. So cash flow becomes another part of the discussion at that point.
Once again, how that best suits each producer's operation is to when they need that, and like you said, because cash flow in agriculture is king.
Right.
So that kind of puts in perspective how the pooled and non-pooled works. The next piece of that puzzle is the deductibles and the subsidies options. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that would work for producers?
Sure. Yeah, that kind of, as you get to this point, the last real call to make is what deductible level am I willing to accept in order to receive the subsidy that I would like to have, and that's a cost-benefit analysis. And again, that could be different in one marketing period versus another.
Sure.
So the deductibles range from $0 to $150. We've kind of, I think, established that $70 is kind of where the practicality of that ends, and the subsidy percentage goes from 18 to 50%. And that becomes a very important part of the discussion on an individual basis. The other thing that kind of goes along with those choices, all the choices that we make, is that premium. And the premium on any of these policies, regardless of how the coverage is set up, is deferred to the end of the covered period. So in the event that you don't have a loss, which is what we're hoping for, is increased markets
right.
and better
right.
and better gross margins. In the event that you don't have a loss, then that premium is billed out at the end of the last targeting period. So if you've got cattle coverage on 1 month at a time, then you could theoretically be getting a bill each month. If you've got cattle covered in 3-month pools, then you would get a bill at the end of that 3-month covered period. Okay. Now, if you have a loss, if there's a gross margin loss and there's a claim that needs to be filed, then part of the claim process, and it's not a long process, but you do have to provide marketing reports as evidence that you actually had and fed and sold the number of cattle that you insured. Okay. And then that premium would be held out of the loss. So if you had a loss that exceeded the premium, they would hold the premium out and you'd get a check for the balance. If you had a small loss but not enough to pay the entire premium, it would send out a reduced premium invoice showing your initial premium, the amount of premium that was paid by the loss, and then the premium that still remains. And then you'd have a reasonable amount of time after that to make payment.
And we threw a lot of information at the producer today to introduce them to livestock gross margin, to learn more and to get a little more in depth on how that program can work for you individually. Just reach out and contact your team at Ag Defense Risk Management, and you'd be glad to sit down and have a conversation and show them how to make that work into each of their own operations.